The book, by the way, also devotes a large portion of the comments to another major concern, which is war, and how wars are being portrayed to the public, what war, how war has become a daily event that goes unquestioned. And I'd like to give the floor now to our friend Becker, Brian Becker, who I'm sure will have interesting thoughts to share on issues like this. The floor is yours, Becker. Good to have you with us today.
Thank you very much, and I too want to thank the ambassador for the invitation, thank the Cuban people and the Cuban government, and Fidel for having been part of a very important initiative bringing together the intellectuals of the world to discuss that monumental topic, saving the planet from war, environmental destruction, and giving the title of the book, We Have a Duty to Struggle. And, you know, I think it's so interesting that the Cubans talk to the intellectuals and say, we, meaning the intellectuals, have a duty to struggle, using that kind of language. And it can't help but remind you of the spirit and the language of a certain German intellectual from 160 years ago. He would have considered himself a revolutionist and a fighter, but certainly recognized as the premier intellectual at that time and since, who said, philosophers have tried to interpret the world. Our point is to change the world. And so the Cuban people and their leadership have asked, challenged the intellectuals of the world, the people of conscience of the world, to come together not to observe the process of war, not to observe the cause of war or the cause of environmental destruction, but in so observing to prepare a program of action so that these scourge, the scourge of war and the scourge of environmental destruction, can be resisted, can be overcome. I mean, that is the task at hand. And I think on the question of war, which is what I intend to address, I think we can't identify the evil of war as simply the absence of peace, but to try instead to decipher the fundamental causes of war so that, having identified them, we can address those causes. And I think we are confronting a real crisis right now as the forces of the U.S. military, overtly and covertly and in league and in tandem with the EU and with the NATO countries and with the Israeli regime, are preparing for a multifaceted assault against the sovereign government in Iran. And we have to look at that, I think, as a case study and say to ourselves and to identify the problem, what is driving the United States and the NATO powers to yet another war in this oil-rich, geostrategically important region? A war, as Fidel has pointed out over and over again in his reflections, and as the Cuban media has tried to alert, a war that could have catastrophic consequences, not simply for Iranians, not simply for the people of the region, but indeed for the entire world. So let's use Iran quickly as a case study and look at the facts, because from those facts we can derive a pattern and an understanding of what's causing this, with the idea of having a remedy. The U.S. and Israel and the NATO powers are asserting that Iran is a nuclear menace, or is about to become a nuclear menace to its neighbors and perhaps to the world. But let's look at the facts. Iran does not possess a nuclear weapon. Iran belongs to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Iran is the most inspected country in the world, having IAEA monitors come in and roam around with video monitors and on-site individual inspections over and over again. Iran has never started a war. At the same time, those who are menacing Iran, who are imposing economic sanctions of the most severe type and preparing for overt and covert operations, have ample numbers of nuclear weapons. The United States has 10,000 nuclear weapons, 7,800 of which are deployed. The U.S. has spent $7 trillion on nuclear weapons since 1942. The United States is the only power in the world that's ever used nuclear weapons, and it did so when it incinerated Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. The United States spends $1 trillion a year on war. $1 trillion a year on war, more than all the other countries in the world combined. Israel, that treats Iran as an existential threat to its existence, has 200 to 300 nuclear weapons, does not belong to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, does not allow IAEA inspectors into its country to monitor its nuclear programs. Likewise, Britain and France, too, have hundreds and hundreds of nuclear weapons. So if Iran isn't really a nuclear menace, if in fact it's simply a targeted country, what drives the endless animosity and antagonism against Iran? We believe in the Answer Coalition that the real reason that there is such animus towards Iran and there's a growing danger of war is not because Iran has nuclear weapons, nor is it because Iran has a sordid history on human rights. I mean, the United States supports the most anti-democratic governments anywhere in the region, such as Saudi Arabia, for instance. That's not the cause. The real reason is, in 1979, Iran had a revolution, overthrew the proxy puppet client government of the Shah, expelled the CIA from its positions of authority, was able to nationalize its own oil and take possession of that oil and use that oil and its resources for the development of Iran. And that Iran has emerged over the last 3 decades in this resource-rich, geostrategically important region as an independent government. And because it is an independent government, it has been targeted by the former colonial powers and in the imperialist powers for destruction. When we look at what the source and danger of war is in the contemporary world, we have to identify the cause, not simply the inability of people to live in peace, but the inability of a particular social and economic order, world capitalism, and in this case led by the United States, is being unwilling to have a live and let live attitude with other governments should they try to assert their own independence, control over their own land, labor, and resources. And so we look back at the past 60 years, and you see in 1950 the United States invaded Korea, and according to the Encyclopedia Britannica, 5 million Koreans perished who would not have otherwise perished. And then 8 years later, the U.S. launched the war in Vietnam, and millions of Vietnamese died. In 1965, the United States invaded the Dominican Republic. In 1982, the United States invaded Lebanon and bombed it. And then a few days later, invaded Grenada. In 1989, it invaded Panama. In 1990, it invaded and bombed Iraq. In 1992, it intervened in Somalia under a humanitarian guise, and 10,000 Somalis died. In 1995, the United States and NATO began bombing Bosnia. In 1999, they dropped 23,000 bombs and missiles on Yugoslavia until Kosovo was finally taken over by Western powers. That was 1999. In 2001, there was the war in Afghanistan. In 2003, the invasion of Iraq. And then in 2011, the bombing of Libya under the pretext of defending civilians under Resolution 1973. I mean, you look at this history of the last 60 years, and you can see that it is war after war after war by the same economic and social order that seeks to maintain the global status quo that allows it to aggregate riches and keeps most of the world's people in poverty. And so when we identify, as the book does and as the Assembly does, the need to eliminate war, we have to identify the source and the cause of war, which we would say is the maintenance of a global economic order, world capitalism, that thrives on and makes war inevitable. And that is, not ironically, the same social and economic order that puts profits first and puts environmental protection last, that removes all obstacles that remain in any way an impediment to the free flow of capital. We have to, as we struggle for peace and a struggle to save the planet, recognize that the powerful forces of global capitalism must be confronted not just in the periphery, but here where they have the central part of their power and their authority. We can see in the Occupy movement, we can see in the movements that are spreading across Europe by poor people and working people and young people, the prospects for a new world, the prospects for change, and recognizing that as we fight against income inequality, as we fight against the disparity that allows not just the 1%, but the 0.11% that controls so much, that we almost must connect that struggle with the fight to save the planet from environmental catastrophe and from the scourge of endless war. Again, we thank the Cubans and the intellectuals who gathered in February in Havana. We hope to be able to promote this book. It's out now, I think, in English as well as Spanish. I think it's a great opportunity to use this as a platform to bring the message of peace and environmental protection and to root it in a bigger, more important, and dominating political context. Thank you.